Jason Calvert, and this is the Historytellers. Tonight, we present part 1 of our series about colonial society on the eve of revolution. We are looking at the people and events that made 13 different groups of colonists into one group of Americans. The term, 13 original colonies, is misleading. Britain ruled 32 colonies in North America by 1775, from Canada to the Caribbean islands. But only 13 of them rose up in rebellion. Some of the British colonies, like Canada and Jamaica, were larger, or wealthier, or even more populous than some of the rebelling 13. Why then did some British colonies eventually strike for their independence, while others did not? Part of the answer can be found in the distinctive social, economic, and political structures of the 13 colonies, and in the halting, gradual appearance of a recognizably American way of life. Tonight, Becky McMurran starts off our show with a report on the generation of British subjects who were born and raised within an emerging American culture.
It's very interesting that among the distinguishing characteristics the colonies shared was a healthy population growth. In 1700, they contained fewer than 300,000 souls, about 20,000 of whom were black. By 1775, 2.5 million people lived in the colonies, of whom about 500,000 were black. White immigrants made up nearly 400,000 of the increased number, and black forced immigrants accounted for almost as many again. But most of the split stemmed from the remarkable natural fertility of all Americans, white and black. To the amazement and dismay of Europeans, the colonists were doubling their numbers every 25 years. This population boom had political consequences. In 1700 there were 20 English subjects for each American colonist. By 1775 the English advantage in numbers had fallen significantly, setting the stage for a momentous shift in the balance of power between the colonies and Britain. The bulk of the population was cooped up east of the Alleghenies, although by 1775 the vanguard of pioneers had trickled into the territories of Tennessee and Kentucky. The most populous colonies in 1775 were Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maryland, in that order. There were only 4 areas that might be considered proper cities. Philadelphia was first with about 34,000 residents, trailed by New York, Boston, and Charleston. About 90% of the people lived in rural areas. For the Historytellers, I'm Becky McMurran.
Colonial America was a melting pot and had been from the outset. The population, although basically English in stock and language, had mixed with numerous European nationalities. Germans made up about 6% of the total population, or 150,000, by 1775. Fleeing religious persecution, economic oppression, and the ravages of war, they had flocked to America in the early 1700s and had settled chiefly in Pennsylvania. They belonged to different Protestant groups, primarily Lutheran, and further enhanced the religious diversity of the colony. These German Americans are incorrectly known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, and they totaled about 1/3 of the Pennsylvania colony's population. In parts of Philadelphia, the street signs were painted in both German and English. These German newcomers moved into the back country of Pennsylvania, where their splendid stone barns gave, and still give, mute evidence of industry and prosperity. Not having been brought up English, they had no deep-rooted loyalty to the British Crown, and they clung heavily to their German language and customs. The Scots-Irish, who in 1775 numbered about 175,000, or 7% of the population, were an important group. They were not Irish at all, but turbulent Scottish lowlanders. Over many decades they had been transplanted to Northern Ireland, where they had not prospered. The Irish Catholics already there, hating Scottish Presbyterianism, resented the intruders. The economic life of the Scots-Irish was severely hampered, especially when the English government placed burdensome restrictions on their production of linens and woolens. Early in the 1700s, tens of thousands of embittered Scots-Irish finally abandoned Ireland and came to America, mainly to much more tolerant Pennsylvania. Finding the best takers already taken by Germans and Quakers, they pushed out onto the frontier. There many of them illegally but defiantly squatted on the unoccupied lands and fought with both Indian and white owners. Already experienced colonizers and agitators in Ireland, the Scots-Irish proved to be superb frontiersmen, though their readiness to visit violence on the Indians repeatedly inflamed the western areas. By the mid-18th century, a chain of Scots-Irish settlements lay scattered along the Great Wagon Road, which hugged the eastern Appalachian foothills from Pennsylvania to Georgia. It was said, somewhat unfairly, that the Scots-Irish kept the Sabbat and all else they could lay their hands on. Pugnacious, Lawless, and individualistic, they brought with them the Scottish secrets of whiskey distilling and dotted the Appalachian hills and hollows with their stills. They cherished no love for the British government that had uprooted and lorded over them, or for any other government, it seemed. They led the armed march of the Paxton Boys on Philadelphia in 1764, protesting the Quaker oligarchy's lenient policy toward the Indians, and a few years later spearheaded the Regulator movement in North Carolina. Many of these hotheads, including the young Andrew Jackson, eventually joined the embattled American revolutionists. All told, about a dozen future presidents were of Scots-Irish descent. About 5% of the multinational colonial population consisted of other European groups. Like many French, Welsh, Dutch, Swedes, Jews, Irish, Swiss, and Scots Highlanders. Except for the Scots Highlanders, most groups felt little loyalty to the British Crown. By far the largest single non-English group was African, accounting for nearly 20% of the colonial population in 1775 and heavily concentrated in the south. The population of the 13 colonies, though mainly Anglo-Saxon, was perhaps the most mixed to be found anywhere in the world. The south, holding about 90% of the slaves, already displayed its historic black and white racial composition. New England, mostly staked out by the original Puritan migrants, showed the least ethnic diversity. The middle colonies, especially Pennsylvania, received the bulk of later white immigrants and boasted an astonishing variety of peoples. Outside of New England, about one-half the population was non-English in 1775. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, 18 were non-English and 8 had not been born in the colonies. As these various immigrant groups mingled and intermarried, they laid the foundations for a new multicultural American national identity unlike anything known in Europe. The French settler Michel Guillaume de Crèvecoeur saw in America in the 1770s a strange mixture of blood, which you will find in no other country, and he posed his classic question, what then is the American, this new man? The African slave trade long had mixed peoples from different tribal backgrounds, giving birth to an African-American community far more differentiated in its cultural origins than anything to be found in Africa itself. Similarly, in the New England praying towns, where Indians were gathered to be Christianized, and in Great Lakes villages such as Detroit, home to dozens of different displaced indigenous peoples, polyglot Native American communities emerged, blurring the boundaries of individual tribal identities. In our next segment, James Calvert explores the structure of colonial society and the impact it had on shaping the culture and identity for a younger generation of colonials.
The structure of colonial society stood in sharp contrast with contemporary Europe, and 18th-century America was a shining land of equality and opportunity, with the notorious exception of slavery. No titled nobility dominated society from on high, and no poor underclass threatened it from below. Most white Americans, and even some free blacks, were small farmers. Dressed in pants made from buckskin, they owned modest holdings and tilled them with their own hands and horses. The cities contained a small class of skilled artisans, with their well-greased leather aprons, as well as a few shopkeepers and tradespeople, and a handful of unskilled casual laborers. The most remarkable feature of the social ladder was the rags to riches ease with which an ambitious colonist, even a former indentured servant, might rise from a lower rung to a higher one, a rare step in Old England. Yet in contrast with 17th-century America, colonial society on the eve of the Revolution was beginning to show signs of stratification and barriers to mobility, and it raised worries that the Americans might become too European. Historians generally contribute these developments to the gods of war. The armed conflicts of the 1690s and early 1700s had enriched a number of merchant princes in the New England and Middle colonies. They laid the foundations of their fortunes with profits made as military suppliers. Sitting regally atop the social ladder, these elites now grew their wealth more finely. They sported imported clothing and dined at tables laid with English china and gleaming silverware. Prominent individuals came to be seated in churches and schools according to their social rank. By mid-century, the richest 10% of Bostonians and Philadelphians owned nearly two-thirds of the taxable wealth in their cities. The plague of war also created a class of widows and orphans, who became dependent for their survival on charity. Both Philadelphia and New York built almshouses in the 1730s to care for the destitute. Yet the numbers of poor people remained tiny compared to the numbers in England, where about a third of the population lived in squalor. In the New England countryside, the descendants of the original settlers faced more limited prospects than had their pioneering ancestors. As the supply of unclaimed soil dwindled and families grew, existing landholdings were repeatedly subdivided. The average size of farms shrank drastically. Younger sons, as well as daughters, were forced to work as laborers for low wages, or eventually to seek remote tracts of land beyond the western mountains. By 1750 Boston contained a large number of homeless poor, who were supported by public charity and compelled to wear a large red P on their clothing. In the South, the power of the great planters continued to be bolstered by their disproportionate ownership of slaves. The riches created by the growing slave population in the 18th century were not distributed evenly among the whites. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of the largest slave owners, widening the gap between the prosperous gentry and the poor whites, who were more and more likely to become tenant farmers. In all the colonies, the ranks of the lower classes were further swelled by the continuing stream of indentured servants, many of whom ultimately achieved prosperity and prestige. And two became signers of the Declaration of Independence. Far less fortunate than the voluntary indentured servants were the paupers and convicts involuntarily shipped to America. Altogether, about 50,000 jail birds were dumped on the colonies by the London authorities. This riffraff crowd, including robbers, rapists, and murderers, was generally sullen and undesirable, and not bubbling over with goodwill for the king's government. But many convicts were the unfortunate victims of circumstances and of a viciously unfair English penal code that included about 200 capital crimes. Some of the deportees, in fact, came to be highly respectable citizens. Least fortunate of all, of course, were the black slaves. They enjoyed no equality with whites and dared not even dream of ascending, or even approaching, the ladder of opportunity. Oppressed and downtrodden, the slaves were America's closest approximation to Europe's volatile lower classes, and fears of black rebellion plagued the white colonists. Some colonial legislatures, notably South Carolina's in 1760, sensed the dangers present in a heavy concentration of resentful slaves and attempted to restrict or halt their importation. But the British authorities, seeking to preserve the supply of cheap labor for the colonies, especially the West Indies sugar plantations, repeatedly vetoed all efforts to stem the transatlantic traffic in slaves. Many North American colonists condemned these vetoes as morally callous, but like most things, money speaks louder than words, and the New England slave traders benefited quite well from the British policy. The cruel complexity of the slavery issue was further revealed when Thomas Jefferson, himself a slaveholder, assailed the British vetoes in an early draft of the Declaration of Independence, but was forced to withdraw the proposed clause by a torrent of protest from Southern slave masters. For the Historytellers, I'm James Calvert.
One of the most honored professions was the Christian ministry. In 1775 the clergy wielded less influence than in the early days of Massachusetts, when piety had burned more warmly. But they still occupied a position of high prestige. Most physicians, on the other hand, were poorly trained and not highly esteemed. Not until 1765 was the first medical school established, although European schools attracted some students. Aspiring young doctors served for a while as apprentices to older practitioners and were then turned loose on their victims. Bleeding was a favorite and frequently fatal remedy. When the physician was not available, a barber was often summoned. Epidemics were a constant nightmare. Especially dreaded was smallpox, which afflicted 1 out of 5 persons, including the heavily pockmarked George Washington. A crude form of inoculation was introduced in 1721, despite the objections of many physicians and some of the clergy, who opposed tampering with the will of God. Powdered dried toad was a favorite prescription for smallpox. Diphtheria was also a deadly killer, especially of young people. One epidemic in the 1730s took the lives of thousands. This grim reminder of their mortality may have helped to prepare many colonists in their hearts and minds for the religious revival that was soon to sweep them up. The law profession was also not well regarded. In this pioneering society, which required much honest manual labor, the parties to a dispute often presented their own cases in court. Lawyers were commonly regarded as noisy windbags or troublemaking rogues, and early Connecticut law classed them with drunkards and brothel keepers. When future President John Adams was a young law student, the father of his wife-to-be frowned upon him as a suitor. This concludes part 1 of our series on colonial society on the eve of revolution. Stay tuned for our next episode where we investigate the growing sense of a new American work ethic that blended itself into the religious structure of society and helped lead the way to the Great Awakening. Remember, history is not a lecture to be heard, but a story to be told. For the Historytellers, I'm Jason Calvert. Good night.